friends, let's start our discussion of today. I'll share the screen. Last time we spoke about verses 20, not 20, but 17 through 27 of our chapter. And I tried to explain my understanding of this passage, which I termed as Pauline reading of this narrative. Having read your commentary, Joel, we discussed different options of interpretation of this passage throughout the Christian history. I can say that the interpretation that I tried to defend last time was, on the one hand, literal, in distinction to those exegetes who saw Jesus' advice to the rich man to distribute his property among the beggars as an allegory or something. And contrary to Luther and others, I think that this is addressed not to this particular man, but to every follower of Jesus, in the same way as the Sermon on the Mount and some other very harsh and paradoxical sayings. And I attempted to interpret this through the lens of the Pauline saying that God has put everyone under. What would be, remember this quotation, what is the correct English rendering of this? This from Romans.
I don't know. All have sinned.
Yes.
Everybody falls short of the glory of God. Yeah.
Yes. God has put everyone under the sin and curse in order to save everyone.
Oh yeah. Right. Romans 11:32. Yeah.
Yes.
God has consigned all to disobedience in order that he may have mercy on all.
Yes, exactly.
It's the most universalistic thing in Paul's teaching. But
yes.
Difficult to say how that coheres with Romans 2, where he talks about judgment on those who have sinned. So, but it's
yeah, but probably Romans 2 corresponds to the first half of this verse.
Okay, yeah.
The first half of this verse, that God has concluded them all in unbelief. That's where Romans 2 puts a full stop. but Romans 11 continues that he might have mercy upon all.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
from
kind of like the idea that he ends up at the end of Romans 11 in somewhere different from where he thought he was going at the beginning of Romans 9. Because it's all a struggle about the fate of Israel. And, Israel that for the most part has rejected the one whom Paul thinks to be the Messiah. But how can that be? Because Israel is God's people. And he says it's a mystery, so maybe that means that it's a mystery that has just been revealed to him.
yes, I must confess that before I started looking at the history of exegesis of this particular passage, I thought that my understanding coincides with the mainstream understanding of this verse, but then I saw that this is not the case.
Mm.
Yes. What would be your interpretation of this episode?
Of Romans 11:32?
No, not from Romans 11:32, but rather of this pericope about Jesus and the rich man, and this very harsh saying to him in verse 21, and Jesus' verdict on those in verse 23.
I don't know. I mean, are we talking about this on the level of the historical Jesus or on the level of what Mark thinks? I mean, I'm not sure if I have the answer either way. And, I think, of course, the sayings against wealth have been very hard for the church. And the church has, from earliest times found ways to get around them. But I do think that the conclusion of the passage, as you say, is important, that there's a recognition that, uh, you know, there's no hope for anyone outside of the grace of God. But I guess I, I'm also aware of the danger of, that seems like an easy way of getting out of the difficulty of some of the, very radical nature of uh, Jesus' ethics as it comes to expression earlier in the passage or, say, in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, is the Sermon on the Mount meant to be a guide for living, or is it just as, certain Lutheran interpretations say, it's just designed to drive you to despair so that you turn to God? Um, I mean, that somehow that seems like what we call a cop out.
How do you call it?
Cop out. That is an easy way to get rid of a problem. I'm not sure exactly where that expression comes from. Anyway, yeah, it seems to me that this sort of thing goes to the heart of the problem of Christian ethics. And I don't know how to solve that problem. I'm not a theologian, I'm just a humble exegete.
Okay. Do you have any additional comments on this pericope? I mean, verses 17 through 27?
No, let's move on because I feel that I'm in danger because I'm a rich person too, relatively.
Okay, then next passage will give us some hope. Лариса, можно спросить прочесть стихи 28-31? Лариса, вы с нами?
Да, я только плохо вижу изображение. Ну, 28-31, да?
Да.
Мгм. Erksato legin ho Petra salto. I dugemeis afekamen panta kai elotekamen soi. Efego Iisus, amen legovimin, udeis estin pos afiken oiken ge adelfus, adelfas, metera, patera, etekna, agrus, veneken emu, kai veneken tu evangelimo. Ean me labe ekatontaplasiona niun ento chairo tuto oikias kai delfus kai delfas kai meteras kai tekna kai agrus metadiogmon kai ento aioni to erchomeno zoen aioni. Poloi de esontai protoi eschatoi kai hoi eschatoi protoi. И до какого, Михаил Георгиевич?
Да, вот как раз вы остановились. Там
Мгм.
как раз я хотел. Петр стал спрашивать у него, Эрксата, а мы оставили все и пошли за тобой. Иисус сказал, истинно говорю вам, всякий, кто оставит свой дом, братьев, сестер, мать, отца, детей или земли ради меня и ради радостной вести, благой вести, получит уже сейчас, в этом времени, среди гонений, во 100 раз больше и домов, и братьев, и сестер, и матерей, и детей, и земель. А в будущем мире получит жизнь вечную. И многие из тех, кто были первыми, станут последними, а последние первыми. Какие-нибудь...
Do you have metadiogmon in your translation there?
Yes, среди гонений.
Okay.
I think this passage also has some parallels with some of Q sayings. So,
Yeah, I was just looking at well, yeah, Mark's, Matthew's, and Luke's version. I don't think it's really from Q, but what's interesting to me there is he doesn't say he talks about leaving your brothers and sisters and father and mother. He doesn't say anything about leaving your wife. But Luke puts that in his version. Gunaika. But it's not there in either Matthew or in Mark. I'm not sure what to make of that.
Yes, Luke's edition is quite logical. So the problem is not the question why Luke added this, but rather why Mark omitted this.
Mm-hmm.
Does he take it for granted that the followers do not have wives?
Well, I don't know. I mean, now there is mention of Peter's mother-in-law in chapter 1. And in one of Paul's letters, I think in the Corinthian correspondence, he's talking about, he says, don't I have the right to have a wife? And then he lists some others, I think including Peter, who do have a wife and who even maybe travel with the wife. I'll find that passage. I think it's in 1 Corinthians. Probably somebody knows exactly where it is, but I'll look for it. But I don't know. I would assume that there were some Christians who were itinerant missionaries who traveled with their wives. Hold on a second. I'm going to consult Rabbi Google about this. The rabbi who has the answers to all the questions. Rabbi Google. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 9:5.
Yes.
Delphine Gunaika.
Yes. This
Period.
speaks us.
Yeah.
This tells us something about the communities to whom with whom Paul correspondent. Can we project this directly onto Mark and his potential audience?
I don't know, but it's interesting, yeah. And the terminology is interesting. She's Adelphe Gunaika, a sister in Christ who is also my wife. And he says that these people are going around periagane, and that includes the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas and Peter. So presumably it implies that other apostles, including Peter and Jesus's brothers, plural, are going around missionizing and they're bringing their wives along.
Okay, then can we understand this passage in Mark as an indication that Mark didn't want to put Gunnar there in order not to be regarded as promoting divorce?
I don't know, what would divorce have to do with it? You mean separation? I mean,
Yes.
it seems to be talking about the Lucan version might be talking about separation from your wife, and you're saying that might imply divorce. I mean, Luke's version is, let's see where it is. Luke chapter 18, verse 29.
But we also have Luke 14:26. That's what I
All right.
had in
Yeah.
mind when I was
All
talking
right.
about Q parallels.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's important, isn't it? That wasn't in my gospel parallels. They should have put it at the bottom of the page. What was that, Luke 14:26?
Yes, 14:26. And your passage was Luke 18 and verse
29.
29.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course the Q version is harsher because it speaks not only about leaving your family members, but also hating them.
There may be some influence from Semitic background, since we have passages in the Hebrew Bible where Ishas Noah, literally the hated wife, is not the wife that one hates, but rather a wife that one loves less than another wife.
Oh, okay.
So,
What is that?
So,
Isha what?
Snoah,
Noaf?
wait a second.
By the way, while you're looking for that, only Luke talks about hating your family members. The parallel in Matthew 10:37 talks about the one who loves father or mother more than me. So there's the same basic idea, but it doesn't have hating in it.
But probably Luke's version is closer to you. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I would think that it's, it's like the text critical principle of more difficult reading. So I would think that there would be a tendency to soften the harshness of Luke's version in the development of the tradition.
Yes, that's the passage that I had in mind when talking about the specific meaning of miseo.
Okay. Oh yeah, all right. Okay, but how is this relevant? So you have one woman who is beloved and the other woman who is hated.
Yes, and most commentators think that what is meant, she is not hated as such, but rather that this wife is less loved and less cherished than the other one.
Okay.
The man has two wives, and he loves both of them and have children from both of them and lives with both of them, but there's one more preferred and one less preferred. In Greek, we have the translation of agapemene and misumene.
Yeah.
But as far as I understand the semantics of the Greek miseo, probably this puts an emphasis on the hatred much more than the Hebrew text.
Yeah.
I remembered this text when we were speaking about our Markan passage.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like people say also that in a passage like, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That seems like it's a straight contrast, but they claim that the sense is, I desire mercy. I desire mercy more than sacrifice. So it's turned into a comparative.
Yes, so probably in that passage that's Luke 14, I've forgotten the number.
29.
29. Luke 14.
Okay, wait. Got it wrong. Hold on. 1426 maybe. Yeah.
Yes.
1426. Yeah.
26.
Well, and that's supported by, again, the parallel in Matthew. The Q parallel is the one who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy. So it's a comparative.
Yes, probably Luke here keeps the Semitic semantics. Messiah, like loving someone less in comparison with another person, and in this case, loving less than the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we don't really know that much about itinerant Christian missionaries and how they were supported, as is presumed in the passage in 1 Corinthians, to go around with a wife. And I guess they probably modeled themselves on the itinerant ministry of Jesus. And I think there's some passages in the Didache that talk about missionaries and, you know, how you should support them. But it's something that a lot of people have been interested in and speculated about, but I don't think, you know, there's much hard evidence about it. I think Garrett Tyson wrote a whole book about Jesus as an itinerant. And he's always interesting, but
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting that in Mark, well, in none of the Gospels do you get a picture, though, of any of the apostles. I mean, there are some women who travel with Jesus, but they don't seem to be married to any of the disciples.
Yes, so this passage stands in clear attention to the earlier.
What? I didn't hear what you said.
The disciples, Jesus' disciples, look at each other and surprised and terrified, they ask each other, "Kaitis dontai sotene?" which is a rhetorical question, probably presupposing that if rich people or people that have something cannot be saved, this means that no one can be saved. This probably implies that they regarded themselves as probably not rich, but at least having some property. At least Jesus' words in verse 24 and Jesus' verses addressed to the rich man, they were somehow uncomfortable for them.
Well, I don't know, because Peter says we've left everything.
Yes.
Maybe you should put the, you need to go back to the Mark passage, I think. You've still got Luke on the screen.
Okay. Let's go back to Mark and passage. The dialogue in the previous pericope,
Yeah.
probably implies that Jesus appealed to poverty and to leaving everything is quite uneasy and uncomfortable for the disciples.
I don't know, it sounds to me like it's comfortable for them, you know, because they have done what he's telling the rich man to do.
But they ask one another, "Kaitis dontai sotene?" which means that they, for them, Jesus' ethical teaching that only those who have left everything can be saved is something that they are uneasy with. But in the very next verse, Peter says that we have left everything and we have followed you. In other words, he does exactly, he confesses of having done exactly the same thing that Jesus demands from them earlier, but earlier they are terrified with hearing this.
Yeah. Yeah,
I see.
okay. Well, that's a
I
good
see.
point, yeah.
I see some contradiction here.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, there's some tension. Did I mention what I had this colleague, Chris Becker, J. Christian Becker, wrote a big book about Paul. And he used to say that theologians like to talk about tension within a passage or in somebody's thought, whereas the average person would just say, that's a contradiction.
And what's the difference?
Tension just sounds like it's less severe, you know. There's just some sort of, uneasiness there, but a contradiction is, like
Okay.
you're saying, no, that's wrong. But I think it's true that, at least in my linguistic field, people love to talk about tensions, and they don't want to talk about contradictions because that implies that there is a something that can't be resolved, I guess, basically. I don't know, but you grew up in under dialectical materialism, so you're used to the idea of opposite ideas and then a synthesis. So
No, that's what, even if this was what original Marx teaching was about, in our youth, Marxism was not about this, but was exactly about what Russian Orthodox faith is now about, namely about loving the General Secretary of the CPSU.
okay.
No Christ, no dialectical thinking.
Okay. Yeah. Well, okay.
It's
Well, you
interesting
know
that,
more about it than I do. Yeah.
yes, it's interesting that quite often I meet people from the West who are talking about Marx and Marxism, and quite often see really important things in this. For me and my generation, it's almost impossible, because for us, it's so heavily associated with a totalitarian way of thinking that
Hmm.
I even cannot discern any kind of dialectics in this. Okay.
Yeah. I think. Yeah. I think Marxism is coming back in certain circles here in the West. I don't know. I just always found Marx hard to read. I think there's a new translation of Capital. Yeah, that's been made into English. That's getting, some press. But it doesn't seem to me that we're heading in the direction of Marxism.
Okay.
Quite the contrary.
In any case, here we see some dialectics or tension or contradiction, whatever you mean.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I'm not sure I've noticed that before.
Друзья, есть ли у нас еще какие-то замечания по поводу этой перекопы или ее соотношения с предшествующей? Это действительно какая-то очень центральная вещь для Евангелия от Марка. И мне действительно поражает, что здесь, с одной стороны, когда Иисус говорит, как трудно тем, что кто что-то имеет почти в Царстве Божие, эти слова поражают учеников ужасом, и дальше тут же ученики говорят о том, что мы оставили все и пошли с тобой, тогда что же поражаться ужасом? Возможно, какие-то разные традиции, которые здесь Марк сочетает. Не знаю. Если у нас нет больше замечаний вот по этим текстам, связанным с богатством и оставлением дома братьев, сестер, матери, отца, детей и в некоторых параллельных текстах жены, то можно перейти к следующей перекопе.
Well, before we go on to the next passage, I mean, could we talk a little bit about, so what is the promise here that, so you leave your physical or natural family, but you get 100 times in this life, ento kairo tuto, you get family members and houses and all of these things, but with persecutions. I mean, that's a tension, it seems to me, that there's a great promise, but it comes with persecutions.
I understood this meta-diogmon as concessive, even though you live with persecutions. In my translation, I made it even more explicit. Всякий, кто оставит дом братьев, сестер, мать, отца, получит уже сейчас, в это времени, среди гонений. Und in Russian, this probably has some idea that despite of persecution.
I mean, yeah, it seems to me that it's part of the kind of central paradox of this gospel, that suffering is the path to revelation and and the explosion of God's power, as sort of epitomized in the crucifixion scene. But I guess it's talking about the Christian community as a new family.
Yes, I think that this is what was meant, at least by Mark.
But so does that new family totally replace the old family? I mean, maybe that's the implication here.
Yes, it goes quite well with the earlier scene when Jill's mother and his brother come to the house where he was.
Yeah.
And
in chapter 3, near the end,
yes. And he speaks about new family.
Yeah, and of course it relates to, like in the Pauline letters, the use of adelphos as a term for fellow Christians.
But by the way, this is one more explanation, and probably the most important, for the omission of wives in verse 29, because obviously Mark wants verses 29 and 30 to be parallel, and if he had inserted wives in verse 39 would have been obliged to insert wives. You should not only have only 100 new brothers and 100 new sisters, but also 100 new wives, which was probably not what Mark really wanted to promise to Jesus'
I mean,
followers.
it sounds good to me. Yeah, but yeah. But I mean, I do think about, how does this really, anti-family tendency relate to, well, for example, in the book of Acts, when people are baptized, they're baptized with their whole house, right? Which includes, presumably, well, it's usually men who are converted, their wives, their children, and even their slaves if they have them. So, and of course, there's instructions in the Pauline letters, and especially in the Deutero-Pauline letters about, the proper ordering of a household in terms of hierarchy. But, this sort of thing seems to go against that kind of idea of hierarchy.
Yes, probably there were different kinds of different ways of life in Christian communities. As far as I understand, we have an idea from the Qumran sectarian texts that some of the people who followed the sectarian way of life, they were unmarried and lived in communities, while others had families.
Yeah.
Like different grades of devotion, for example, among Franciscans. The monks and nuns, but they're also, I think in English it should be third order Franciscans, those who live with their families but still follow in some respect the rules of St. Francis.
Yeah. No, you're probably right. Yeah. That's a good comparison.
And of course, the last sentence of this pericope, "Polo descentoi protoi eschatoi," eschatoi protoi. This also has parallels in many gospel traditions.
Yeah. The syntax here is strange, don't you think? Poloi de esontoi protoi eschatoi. Okay, eschatoi protoi. Maybe it's just because it's so compressed.
I don't know. One should be a very good Greek stylist in order to comment on this. Маша, как вам кажется, или этого кусочка?
Ну, я не могу сказать, насколько он плох. Не знаю.
Окей. Но так или иначе, это действительно мысль, которая встречается многократно в разных евангельских текстах. Наверное, ее многократная встречаемость может служить хорошим аргументом в пользу того, что все-таки здесь мы можем возводить эту идею что многие из первых станут последними, последние первыми. Historical Jesus.
I mean, it's difficult to tell what's the subject and what is the predicate nominative. And the texts that have the hoi at the end make that more clear.
Yes. I think here, following the general rules of the Greek verbless clauses, one should understand the first nominative phrase as subject and the second as predicate. Protoi subject, eschatoi predicate. Eschatoi subject, protoi predicate.
I mean, you could translate it something that there will be many people who are first and last, and many who are last and first. I mean, in other words, you could take them both as the subject, protoi eschatoi, as sort of a combined phrase. But maybe that doesn't make any sense. But it's just, it seems to me like it's hard grammar to just grasp hold of when you hear it.
We can look closer at the grammar of the Greek verbless. That's not verbless, but rather of the Greek. How would you call this?
Well, I think
Binominal clause.
yeah. Well, and especially, well, I mean, at least the second clause has no verb. It just has two adjectives that function as nouns, I guess.
И многие из тех, кто были первыми, станут последними, а последние первыми. That's my Russian translation.
Yeah.
Of course, I put some more verbs here.
And what does из тех mean?
Many from those
Okay.
who were first will be last, and last first.
Yeah. I mean, isn't the sense there are many of those who are now first who will be last?
Maybe the other way. Yes, this is shorter and probably better in Russian.
Jared, may I ask a question?
Пожалуйста.
Yeah. Yeah. It's probably a bit far from the discussion, but I just wanted to ask you whether you thought about connecting this scene with your idea of man Adam, and with this scenery, this protos and eschatos, like
Uh-huh.
I don't know, making people like new Adams and like returning the disciples to the state when there were no families, no possessions, and like this
Well,
primary
that's-
state
yeah.
of people, and also this idea of eternal life. It also in the Old Testament it appears in this Adam story in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. So it could be somehow connected.
Yeah,
Uh, what do you think about it?
yeah, I like that. And of course, I mean, it draws on the basic principle that the end is a restoration of the beginning. Of course, I mean, like in the Genesis story, I don't know, is there or isn't there a family there? I mean, there's Adam and Eve. So, and they are bound together. But then, you know, maybe that's why the Gunaika, you know, isn't present in Mark's version of it. Yeah, I think it's worth pondering. I mean, I want to see Adam everywhere. So, but I'm not sure exactly how it fits here. But I mean, but yeah, but I would certainly say that mention of eternal life does recall the Genesis story. Because that's, I mean, God is afraid that they'll stretch out their hand and eat of what, the tree of life. So I think it's worth thinking about. Though they didn't wander around, right? They were set in the garden, and they were only kicked out of it after they sinned, and thus began, you know, the exile, I guess, if you will, wandering on the earth. Well, I guess I'm ready to move on and go up to Jerusalem.
Okay, let's go to Jerusalem.
I mean, I don't know if we'll get there today, but
Okay, but in any case, we still have a lot of time to go to Jerusalem. Now we are just moving in this direction.
we're on the move, and they're on the move in all of these chapters, 8, 9, and 10.
Yes?
But I think this may be one of the few passages in which that's made specific at the beginning of verse 32.
Да. Это у нас третье предсказание о том, кто... Третье предсказание смерти и воскресении. И как у нас всегда бывает рядом с предсказаниями, перекопы о непонимающих учениках. Давайте вначале прочтем третье предсказание. Лариса, готовы продолжить свою функцию нашей чтицы?
Да, конечно.
Хорошо, спасибо вам.
Esande en tegodo anabainuntes eis Jerusalema, kai en proagon autus o Iisus, kai etambunto. Oide acolutontes efobunto, kai paralabon palin tus dodeca, exata autois legenta, melenta auto сюмбайны годі. Іду анабайнумен ейс Єрусалюма, кайго гіос ту антропу, парадотесетай, тойс архиреусин, кай тойс грамотеусин, кай катакринусин аутон, танато, кай парадосусин аутон, тойс этнисин, кай эмпайдзусин ауто, кай эмплюсусин ауто, кай мартюгосусин аутон, кай апуктенусин, кай метатрейс гемерес анастеситай.
Они поднимались к Иерусалиму. Мне таки важно, что они нашли вверх, даже если это какое-то, может быть, не столько физическая, сколько символическая вещь, понимаете, да? Алия. Иисус шел впереди, и идущие за ним были поражены ужасом, шли и боялись. Он подозвал к себе 12 и стал говорить им о том, что ждет его. Вот мы восходим в Иерусалим, там Сын Человеческий будет отдан на расправу старшим священникам и толкователям Писания. Они осудят его на смерть и отдадут язычникам. Над ним будут глумиться и плевать в него, и бить его кнутом, и убьют его. Но через 3 дня он воскреснет. I think your commentary will have a good table of comparison between between the 3 predictions. Probably not at this place, but I think it will be good for us now to compare all the 3 places that you have read by now. Do you remember on which page of your commentary do we have this comparison of the 3 predictions?
I don't know. I'll find it. This one is the most detailed, I think.
Yes.
Well, let's see. I have a list of figures, so that should help. Oh, page 604, I think.
604. Wait a
Yeah.
second. Exactly. I'll share
Okay.
the screen.
I give you permission to do that. And I won't even ask for royalties
Thank you. But
because I'm
You-
Marxist.
yes, you know, we have a lot of books on our virtual shelves. Too many books in order to ask everyone for royalty, for permission, and to pay royalties.
It's okay, I'm a Marxist, so I think everything belongs to everybody.
Yes. Wait a second.
Except for my iPad.
Сейчас видно?
Yeah, but yeah, okay. Yeah, I think you need to shrink it a little bit. The picture is too big.
Okay. Now that's better?
Yeah, and now the previous page.
Yes.
Yeah.
The most important question, of course, that we meet here is what might have been the origin of these three predictions. You refer here to Bultmann, who has argued that the passion predictions are prophecies after the fact, and also to some, can we say, more conservative commentators who think that they
Yeah, I think so.
contain a
Yeah.
historical core.
Well, and my friend Dale Allison, who I quote here, who writes a lot, I just looked at a book of his that's in press, in which he talks about, this presupposition that if there's a prediction of something that then comes true, that necessarily means that it's an after the fact prediction. And, he takes seriously the idea of that there are some people who can foresee the future, clairvoyance. And he thinks it's just a rationalistic prejudice that, says that nobody could predict the future so exactly. And interestingly, I'm at SBL next week. I'm doing a paper on Joseph Klausner, who was a Jewish early Zionist thinker who wrote a book about Jesus, which was published in Hebrew originally in 1922. And he talks about these passages, and he thinks there's a historical core, but he says the opposite of what Allison says. He says, well, obviously, Jesus couldn't have predicted that. He may have predicted that he would encounter suffering, but he couldn't have predicted that he would be killed and then rise in 3 days. So that's obviously not part of the original prediction. So, but I do think there's there would be a distinction between quote conservative commentators and more skeptical commentators on where this comes from and the extent to which it is a prophecy after the fact.
But in any case, these passion predictions are very much in line with the overall Markan worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this one is, I think, especially remarkable because, there's such an emphasis. All of them end with saying, and at the end, he'll rise again. You know, but here, there's, you know, the bulk of it is a prophecy of the sort of sufferings that he'll endure. I think another thing that's interesting also is, you know, throughout the first part of the gospel, Jesus' main opponents have been the Pharisees, sometimes combined with the scribes. But here there's no mention of the Pharisees. And it's instead, in our version, also in the one in chapter 8, it's the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. And here the chief priests and the scribes. Whereas in, you know, some of these controversy stories in chapter 2 and 3, it's the scribes or the scribes and the Pharisees. Or even in one case, the scribes of the Pharisees. But the Pharisees drop out here, at least for the moment. And in the actual Passion narrative, which begins in chapter 14, the Pharisees don't appear. It's the chief priests and the scribes who are the ones who condemn Jesus to death.
But this may be closer to historical truth, because whatever authority the Pharisees must have had in rural communities of Judea, as far as we know, by that time they had no authority in Jerusalem.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's interesting because I have a whole appendix, and maybe we should talk about this sometimes, on like the enemies of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And I go through the Pharisees, scribes, and chief priests maybe. And in Mark, the picture is that the Pharisees are in Galilee, but not in the Jerusalem narrative. Whereas in Josephus, he has Pharisees being in Jerusalem and not outside of Jerusalem. At least I think that's the way he describes it. So I don't know what to make of this Markan portrait of Pharisees in Galilee. And somebody like Bultmann, I think, would say that this reflects the later church's struggle with the Pharisees. You know, that the Pharisees, I'm not sure if this is Bultmann or, you know, others later who would say this, but the Pharisees in Josephus's narrative are just like, they're one party amongst many, and they're not even they don't have the most political power. Though Josephus says that they're popular with the people, and the people do everything the way that they say. But at least, you know, one common understanding has been that before 70, the Pharisees were just one party amongst many. And that it was really the Sadducees and the temple hierarchy that had the political power, but then their power center was destroyed by the destruction of the temple, and the Pharisees then began to become the most important Jewish group that survived. But it's a very complicated subject, and I don't know, maybe we should talk about it sometime.
Yes, but in any case, in Mark, Pharisees are not guilty of Jesus' death.
Well, yeah, in chapter 3, verse 6, they go out and
They want.
they want to kill him. Yeah.
Yes. But the other people who did it.
True. Yeah. And the linkage between the two sections is the scribes. You know, in the first half of the gospel, or until the Passion narrative, it's usually the Pharisees and the scribes who are opposing Jesus. In the Passion narrative, and already in these predictions, it's the scribes and the chief priests. So the one common factor is the scribes in both parts of the gospel in terms of enemies of Jesus.
Okay. Let's go back to our text, but before this, let's have a last look at the comparison of these three predictions. In fact, we have at least three possibilities. Either all three predictions were Markan creations, or Mark had some tradition about predictions and used it thrice in his gospel, or even the pre-Markan tradition had three predictions. What would be your attitude?
I mean, the middle one, the one from chapter 9, is the simplest one. And I think you could make an argument that that is, you know, what's come down to Mark, or some version of that. And then he's fleshed it out. And you know, I think most interesting to me is the difference between, you know, the ones who hand Jesus over in Mark 9 are, those to whom he is turned over are human beings. Whereas in chapter 8 and chapter 10, it's the chief priests and scribes, also the elders in chapter 8, which is more specific. So if I were to guess, I think I would say that maybe the pre-Markan tradition is something like the one in chapter 9, and then Mark has developed the other two. I mean, it does seem, it's kind of hard to believe, just on a historical level, that Jesus would have to say it this 3 times. I mean, after he'd said it once, you know, one would think that they would either ask for some clarity, or that they would have learned their lesson. But I think it is part of the picture of the disciples in this part of the gospel that he keeps telling them things and they don't understand. Or another example is how both in chapter 6 and in chapter 8, you know, he feeds people miraculously. And even after he's done that in chapter 6, you know, when he tells them to go distribute their bread and their fish, they say, how are they going to do this? You know, when they've already seen how he can perform a miracle. So I do think that the 3 passion predictions it fits into the Mark's theme of the disciples not understanding and falling more and more into the state of incomprehension that in chapter 4 was ascribed to the outsiders.
Yes. Can we say that the first prediction and the last prediction mark, in fact, the beginning and the end of the journey, while the second is just in the middle?
I don't understand what the point that you're making.
Just to look at the place of these predictions within the story. The first prediction takes place in the Caesarea,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
just before Jesus starts his march towards Jerusalem. The last
Right.
prediction takes place just before they came to Jericho, which is already in the environs of Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yeah,
So-
no, I think that's right. Yeah.
May
So they mark some.
May I ask a question, please?
Okay.
It seems to me that the third prediction is a brief preliminary story of passions. And Mark sometimes writes like that when before the main story, he gives the preliminary picture. Like when he writes about healing of a blind man before the Peter's confession. And as you said now, when the second prediction of the second prediction is given before the transfiguration, because this is the moment of glory. But before this, we have the preliminary story of passions.
Yeah,
What do you
it's
think?
no, I like that. It's the first prediction comes right before the transfiguration, right? And yeah. No, I like that. And for me, the question in terms of Mark's overall narrative is, so these three predictions together present Jesus as knowing in advance and showing the disciples exactly what's going to happen. So then why, when it does happen, well, A, does he ask to be delivered from death? And why, does he cry out on the cross, that asking God why he's abandoned him? In other words, he's shown in the early part of the gospel as knowing, and as you say, giving an exact preliminary view of what's going to happen. But then when it does happen, it seems to take him by surprise, and certainly it takes the disciples by surprise. But I think the more difficult kind of theological problem is posed by the contrast between his certainty in the early part of the gospel and his doubt and uncertainty and despair in the passion narrative. Yeah, but I think he does often, especially in the first part of the gospel, he foreshadows things. And as you say, like the two stories of the healing of blind men, which bracket this whole section, those are deliberately placed there, and they point towards some revelation that's coming. And I think what they also, and that's also true, say at the end of chapter 13, where he says, he calls on his disciples to watch and be alert and look, see what's happening, see how the end is going to come. And then what comes is the passion narrative. And I think that suggests that, in some sense, this is the end. The passion narrative is the eschatological end that he's, prophesying in a graphic way in chapter 13. So it's sort of a preview and a call to attention to see what's going to happen. But yeah, I think that's a very good comparison.
Okay. Yes, these three predictions form the backbone of the whole narrative. And in all three cases, we have seen that these predictions are followed by reproaches that Jesus addresses to his disciple. First to Peter, because Peter wanted to stop him, and then in the case of second and third predictions, to the disciples who, instead of understanding the theology of the cross, started quarreling and asking themselves who is greater, or who will be to the right and to the left of Jesus in his future glory. I think this.
But I think that's important, that he rebukes them, but then he always goes on to explain some more, right? So he doesn't ever end with the rebuke. After each of the passion predictions, there's some display of the incomprehension of the disciples, and Jesus rebukes them for it, but then he goes on and teaches some more. So I think that's important because he doesn't leave them in darkness.
Yeah, but there's also a clear opposition in all three cases between Jesus' theology of the cross and the disciples' theology of power and teaching to the right and to the left of Jesus, for instance. I think this is these predictions form the backbone of Markan narrative, then probably this opposition between the cross theology of Jesus and the theology that Mark ascribes to Jesus' disciples seems also to be extremely important for the plot of the gospel and for what he was trying to say.
I agree with that, and it must be important for Mark and his audience. He must think that his audience needs to hear that. Yeah, that, you know, real power is gained through being a servant. Real power isn't sitting on the right hand, but somehow, you know, going up with Jesus to Jerusalem, suffering, and yet in that suffering, you know, God's power breaks forth.
Okay, in this way we, following Jesus, we came to verse 35 of our text.
Please, one more thing, that the third prediction is given to the 12, who will be, for the early church, the main witnesses of the resurrection.
No, yeah, I think that's important. And not only, yeah, the witnesses, but also, you know, people who will go on and, you know, some of them at least suffer and die for Jesus. So it worked. But you're right, you know, that, I mean, their place in the church came from not only having been with Jesus, but also having been witnesses of the resurrection.
Okay, then next time we'll start with verse 35. But as far as I understand, our next meeting will be not next Thursday, but after Thursday, because next Thursday will be HSBL.
Yeah, so the following Thursday is Thanksgiving, and I'll be busy, so I wouldn't be able to do it until 3 weeks from today. So
On the 5th of December.
yeah, that's fine for me.
Okay, let's fix our next meeting on the 5th of December.
Okay.
And we'll start with the question of who will sit to the right and to the left of Jesus.
The question of, I didn't hear that.
Of who will sit to the right and to the left of Jesus.
All right. Well, obviously not James and John, but or maybe so.
Maybe so.
Yeah, okay, that's a good place to start. Okay. До свидания.
До свидания.
Спасибо, до свидания.
Thank you so much.
Спасибо. Bye.
Спасибо, Джоэль.
Спасибо.